Hello, good morning everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for this lovely little venue. This is very unexpected. I really enjoy myself having the opportunity to speak in this wonderful Untitled. Thank you to everyone for managing to sort of like put this together despite all the sort of like hiccups. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to sort of like talk about a project of mine that I've been sort of like working on, which is to look at a particular type of performance art tradition that has developed in Penang. And it's called sort of like the Boria. It came originally from the Muharram sort of celebration. And what you see here on the screen are actually sort of like three figures playing out a sort of like sketch near the Botanical Gardens, where in the traditional sort of like Muharram celebration, this is where they will end up to sort of like do what they call the Mandi Tolak Bala, which is the washing away of the sins once after the Muharram celebration is sort of like finished. They would sort of like go to the waterfall and then sort of botanical gardens and then sort of like wash away all the bad luck that accrued and all the sort of like the kind of like tensions and conflicts that have sort of like accrued over the years, over the time that the Muharram, that we were sort of like processing during the Muharram, and then that would essentially sort of like clear up all the sins, and they would sort of like begin the following year. And in the sort of like in the 1970s, the Muharram celebration is no longer sort of like practiced in sort of Penang. What happened is that a type of performing art tradition then sort of like emerged, which is called the Boria, and very often it includes a kind of like play acting sort of component where you play out a sketch, and this sketch is something that I want to sort of like talk about in my sort of like presentation. But just to sort of like give this sort of bit of a sort of like historical sort of like context to the subject I'm sort of like looking at, I mean, as much as the Muharram sort of like celebration is rooted in sort of like condition of sort of colonialism, you can really sort of like think of the interconnection of the Indian Ocean that stretches back in time all the way back to sort of like the 11th sort of like century, especially in a map that sort of appeared in a kitab from Cairo. That even sort of like depicts the sort of like Indian Ocean sort of like world. This interconnection really stretches back into time and not only defined by a shared experience of sort of like colonialism. So alongside trade is also the trafficking of sort of like ideas. And if we look more closely on the sort of like the right half of the map, you get to see how it describes the trade that goes from India, all the Indian cities, you start from the upper left sort of like corner, all the way down to China. And Southeast Asia sort of like sits somewhere in the middle as a sort of like refueling stop, as a stop for sort of like exchange of different kinds of like trade goods that would enable and facilitate a sort of like huge chain of exchange that began, in the Arab world all the way to sort of like China. China down in the lower left sort of like corner. Okay, but I think this is another map that's also showing Southeast Asia. It's called the Southern map that's currently in sort of like Oxford, and also it's the only surviving sort of like Chinese merchant map that's still sort of like existed. And interestingly, this is made in sort of a place like Aceh, which you would normally not associate with, a Chinese sort of like population, right? But this is just, I want to sort of like bring up these two maps to sort of like give you a sense of, I guess, Southeast Asia being a sort of like vibrant sort of like stopover hub for different sort of like communities to sort of like meet and interact with each sort of like other. And this often translates during the colonial sort of like period, especially with the establishment of a port city like Penang, into a kind of like colonial sort of like ordering of sort of space that's centered on this idea of the divide and rule, right? And very often when we think of this kind of like divide and rule, the alternative theory is to assume that if you were not to sort of like see this as a divide and rule, then what is happening on the ground is necessarily syncretic in nature, right? It is, but increasingly scholars are also sort of like thinking of how problematic this idea of syncretism sort of like is as a way to sort of like think about some of these issues. Another theory that has emerged in this part of the world, in our sort of like part of the world, is this idea of the composite. What is the composite, especially in relation to sort of like port cities and coastal sort of like townships, where different things can sort of like sit next to each other very comfortably, and in many ways find its own way of sort of like negotiating a kind of like temporal rhythm on its sort of like own ground. And this is where we come to this idea of the borea. And a borea formation is like a minstrel sort of like troupe. It sort of like moves from house to house, basically singing whatever the patron wants them to sort of like sing, and they will often sort of like play dress up. So in some cases they'll dress up as, I don't know, Native Americans, other times they'll dress up as sort of like an African American person, and other times they'll dress up as different kinds of like, people that you would normally find, surprisingly, people you don't normally expect to sort of like find in Southeast Asia will have a kind of like presence, testifying to the fact that I think in a colonial port city, you just really don't know who will end up on your sort of like doorstep in many ways, right? Within this sort of like ecology that I'm sort of like talking about, the main sort of like date that I'm looking at is 1919, and this is a borea season that was actually recorded in one of the learned society sort of like journal called the Royal Asiatic Society of the Malayan branch of the Royal Asiatic sort of like society. And in that particular journal, Alexander sort of like Hamilton, Arthur Hamilton, actually one of the sort of like colonial scholar official, managed to record an entire sort of like borea season and walked us through what actually sort of like happened during that period. So the borea season is in many ways speaks to the kind of like divide within a sort of like colonial port city. Very often, the main center of sort of like commercial activity happens in the bandar or the kota, which you see in the lower side, and this is centered on sort of like Beach Street. That is where the sort of like commercial activity sort of like takes place. But fringing the sort of like kota, which is the sort of like center of the city, are the kampongs, or the village, or the urban sort of like village. And these are often where the sort of like more economically disadvantaged population would reside in. And borea very often comes out of these sort of like villages that fringe the entire sort of like city sort of area, right? You would see in some of these sort of like old photographs, even the presence of sort of like police officers, such as that figure over there on the left here. I don't know. Oh, yeah, this figure over here. You see this figure over here. These are sort of like police officers that are playing a role in sort of like surveillance in all these sort of like kampong area. Very often, what you will get the sense of is that it is a very police sort of like space, increasingly sort of like police space, especially when it comes to public assembly. Because 19th century, the Muharram was a time where a lot of sort of like riots sort of like happened. So in order to curtail the sort of like Muharram celebration, they sort of created and passed a lot of public assembly sort of like laws. In fact, the desire to even sort of like gain a measure of autonomy from India. Penang used to be part of, the fourth Indian sort of like presidency. But in order to gain some measure of sort of like control so that they can enact a stricter kind of like public assembly laws, the local sort of like elites actually sort of managed to convince the colonial sort of like government to sort of like turn Penang into autonomous kind of like colonial settlement. And with the turning of the colonial settlement, they were able to sort of like enact all these sort of like laws to curtail the celebration of Muharram. But what happened with the curtailment is that all these sort of like borea groups then began to sort of like, all the celebrants of the Muharram then began to sort of like hide themselves or escape into all these sort of like urban sort of like fringe villages, and began to sort of where borea groups then began to sort of like emerge. Sort of, what I've done is also I've sort of like mapped out where, using the kind of like chorus lines from Arthur Hamilton, I've mapped out where all the borea groups sort of like existed, and you see that the center of sort of like commercial activity, normally, it's along Beach Street, but you'll find that all the borea sort of like groups are are normally affiliated with villages or urban villages that are in many ways cut out of, the ability to sort of participate meaningfully in the colonial sort of like economic sort of like order of things. Yeah. And so, what is the sort of like Oriental, and why do I find these sort of like choruses sort of like interesting? Let us look at some of these choruses and sort of like try to make sense of them. Very often, what you get to see, so I've sort of translated some of these choruses, and very often you get to see the first, it comes in a type of Malay sort of like poetry called the Syair. And the Syair has sort of like Arabic sort of like origins, but sometime in the sort of like 17th century, there was a Sufi mystique from Sumatra began sort of like introducing this kind of like, Syair with a rhyming scheme of A, in order to sort of like introduce a new way in which you can sort of like play with the sort of Malay language. And, in the Malay, if you read it in sort of like Malay, like Habsi Afrika, orang ulu kerja mencari alam batu, serata tempat tiada tentu bagan tanjung bunga menjadi satu. So it's always with the A sort of like rhyming scheme. But what's happening in a very sort of like interesting manner is that often in the sort of like chorus line that's being sung by the warrior troop, you have the first line where it always begins with this imagination of assuming the role of this other person or this other community or these other people from somewhere else in the world. So in the first portrait, you see them playing the role of the Habshi from Africa. And this would often tell you that they would and sort of like, do kind of like play acting where they sort of don on the costume and play the role of a sort of like, an African sort of like person, roaming around the streets of sort of like Penang. In the second instance, they play the role of, soldiers from sort of like Yunnan in China. And in the third instance, they pretend that they're sort of like Malay robbers who are in English land, trying to sort of like rob the English of their sort of like wealth. Nyor is a coconut farm. Nyor is a coconut farm. Three majlis is like a congregation, right? So that's the name of the group itself. Right. So it always starts off with being somewhere else, playing the role of being somewhere else, and then the second and third line describes the circumstances or instances in which that compel them to sort of like do something, or enact a sort of like action, or undertake a certain kind of activity. And the last line always ends with a declaration of which particular village they come from. That very local sort of like village they sort of like come from, and the declaration of sort of like pride almost. Yeah. More examples include, that they can also play someone from the heavenly sort of like a boat or the kayangan, or you can play the sort of like Bedouins from sort of like Mandung, or even sort of like use some sort of like Magi, right? And the chorus line sort of like takes on very sort of like formulaic kind of like way in which the assumed sort of like identity that you are play acting is always first declared, and then the actions that sort of like compel the person to sort of like undertake a kind of like activity, and it ends up sort of like almost as if suggesting that all these sort of like people from different parts of the world will end up in the village that these sort of like players would sort of like come from, and that's the declaration of village of origin that they sort of like exist in. So what does all this kind of like mean? In many ways, it's speaking to and responding to a kind of like imperial kind of rhyming scheme, right? Where you see in the use of sort of like circulation of kind of like images in reprographics of the sort of like late 19th century, where similar kind of like image, such as this particular image, is used on one occasion to describe a Ceylonese kind of like performance. On another occasion, it's simply just used to describe a coolie or sort of like operatic sort of like performance amongst the indentured labor class on a boat, right? As the sort of like indentured laborers sort of like sail to sort of different parts of the world, possibly even to Trinidad and Tobago, right? This is another example where a Caucasian, where a trans-Caucasian sort of like image that initially sort of like represent the Muharram sort of like celebration in Trans-Caucasia is then suddenly sort of like re-inscribed and given sort of injected with a new meaning to describe the Muharram celebration in sort of like Penang. So the imperial sort of like use and circulation of an image also sort of like plays with a kind of like interconnection between different kinds of like circulation of people and ideas and images of especially sort of like the indentured class across the empire. Or at the same time, there's also this sort of like affectation that sort of like go on with play acting, fancy dress balls, especially amongst the comprador sort of like class. As you sort of like accrue power and wealth, there is almost as if the power of capital to sort of like transform oneself in relation to professions and ethnicities mapped out neatly on a sort of stable typology, each marked with a recognizable sort of headdress, clothing and implement. And this is a type of kind of like play, where one uses the self to become and assume another. And this story is sort of like accounted as a kind of like journey. I think that sort of like parallels the ability to sort of like shapeshift as well as to sort of like create context with other worlds. And that sort of like tomfoolery about this sort of like young gentleman we have in front of us has a very interesting sort of like relationship to the ability to sort of like play in this instance. And for all these young gentlemen sort of like here, the ability to sort of like play through the fancy dress ball affirms the larger narrative of sort of like the self-made in the port city, right? As you accrue enough sort of like capital, you're basically able to sort of like know what's happening in different parts of the world. So you have, all your Chinese sort of like comprador sort of gentlemen, playing the Malay chief, an Ottoman sort of like officer, sort of either a Parsi or Armenian looking sort of like person. Maybe someone can help me identify that bearded gentleman over there who I can't quite figure out. A Burmese, a man and wife, representing the ideal institution of sort of like marriage, as well as, a suit of patterns of sort of like playing cards, as sort of like court jester, as a sort of like court jester. But what we have in front of us here, I think is an allegory of sort of like the spirit of print capitalism, represented by the man on the left there, playing the newspaper, coursing through, possessing all these sort of like homosocial bodies, configuring and reconfiguring their relationships with the world, premised almost entirely on sort of like dumb luck and pure chance, as represented by all the suits of sort of like cards. Right? When it comes to sort of like dumb luck and pure chance, chances are these sort of like knowledge and this way of sort of like thinking is going to sort of like leak out of your sort of like social milieu. And that is where sort of like the Borea sort of like comes in. And that's where we start to learn how to sort of like play relatives. And think, with the Borea, with the use of the Shire language, essentially what I like to think of the Shire when it sort of like came into the Malay language. The Malay language is as if it learned how to sort of like drop acid. I like to think of the Malay language having to sort of like learn how to sort of like drop acid in the sort of like early modern world. Suddenly you are able to learn how to connect one thing to another thing, 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 to another. This interconnection, the nature of sort of like things. We can think of interconnection through a number of different lenses. The first is the tufa, the silsila, right? Where Ng Seng Ho sort of like describes it as a tufa, a gift. So amongst the sort of like Hadrami scholars, it's a way of, on another level, in the sort of like early 20th century, this idea of sort of like genealogy is not a vertical one anymore. It's also a demonstration of one's affinity according to sort of like kinship. So with the publication of the Silsilah of Raja Raja Melayu in 1938, you see a sense that the Malay kings were not only interested in demonstrating sort of like lineages in terms of line of descent, but also amongst each other, in order to give a sense that this idea of the race, the Malay race, then sort of become a new kind of like paramount kind of like identity in which you begin to sort of like claim kinship on a horizontal sort of like level. Suddenly, all the kings are related because they are all sort of like Malay kings. They're not just kings that trace their lineage back to Alexander the Great, but they are kings because they are related to each other. They get to claim that they are part of, they're really the leaders in this institution or in this sort of like racial group called the Malays, right? But these are sort of like, examples of how those who can sort of like accrue capital are able to sort of like create or construct this sort of like this kind of like gift of elective sort of like affinity, right? But I think what is interesting in this sort of like period is that this kinds of like genealogy sort of like making is not limited to those who can accrue capital, material or sort of like symbolic, yeah? In the sort of like 18th century, a particular kind of like story then began to sort of like emerge. It's called the Hikayat Kang Tua, and it talks about the sort of like 15th century in sort of like the Malay Sultanate. And it describes the Laksamana, who is an admiral in the Malay, the word means admiral in the Malay world, where he is then exiled from the Malaccan court for not following the orders of sort of like the Sultan. So he arrives in this, in order to win the Sultan's sort of like favor, he had to sort of like, go off and try to win the princess back for the sort of like Sultan, in order to sort of like, make peace with the sort of like Sultan. So he went off to a neighboring sort of like sultanate in order to try to win the favor of this sort of like princess who refused initially to marry the sultan, right? So at this neighboring court, there's this performance of what Muhammad Haji Saleh, a Malay sort of like scholar, calls an act of one-downmanship. And the story sort of like goes is that he enters the sort of like court, and there were these sort of like singers who were sort of like supposed to perform for him, and they would ask him, good my lord, what kind of melody shall we play? Since the melodies of the people of Indrapura, which is the neighboring sort of like court, are not really that Malay, it's not truly Malay. We may be Malays, but we are sort of like hybrid. We're not like the real Malays of Malacca, where Hang Tuah sort of like came from. And then the Laksamana sort of like smiled and then say, okay, yeah, sure, the Malay people in Malacca might be true Malays, but really we are also sort of like mixed with Javanese sort of like blood. And then you're actually acting like one of us because you want to put me into this test, right? So it's almost as if this exchange is one about who is real and who's not, who's authentic, and who is sort of like of mixed blood, who is the inauthentic in this sort of like instances. So upon hearing the words of the Laksamana, the five singers then says, you two are acting like one, sir, because you're putting us to the test. Why are you subjecting us to this sort of like repartee, as if you're sort of not believing that we have the capacity to sort of like, play along with you. And the Laksamana sort of like, in this very Bollywood sort of like moment, turned around and sort of like smiled, and the five singers started to sort of like laugh, picked up the drums and started to play. And the Laksamana was offered a goblet, and the five drums sounded as one, and the singers sang very sweet with their voices. Then Tunjanao rose to dance. After 2 or 3 steps, he is the sort of like, the representative from Indrapura. He invited the Laksamana to sort of like join him, and the Laksamana rose and danced while arranging himself and making himself look smart. And then the Laksamana sort of like said, do not put me again to the test by making me sort of like dance, because the lord of this man from Malacca is mixed with Majapahit, sort of like a Java blood. He does not know how to sort of like dance. And then Tunjanao then answered, what words are you saying, sir? We are playing relatives. You should not have distrust in your heart. And the Laksamana danced, so very elegant was his dance, and the people in Indrapura never had seen a dance like the Laksamana sort of like dance before. So this sort of like exchange really sort of like captured, I guess, a tale full of sort of like irony, and the irony is what we need in order not to be torn away by our conflicting desires for intervention or sort of like disavowal, right? It shows us how to play with love and life. It teaches us how to cope with our anxieties, and above all, it tells us how to deal with language and sort of like writing. At the heart of it is a tension generated by the sumbo, which is the authentic, and the kachukan, which is the inauthentic, or the bastardized, or the hybridized, the pure authentic, or the bastard, or the sort of like hybrid. In this, the discussion of sort of like identity in terms of sungguh and kachukan does not result in a conclusion. There was not any sort of like conclusion of who is actually real or not. In the act of sort of like one-downmanship, everyone is claiming that they're not really sort of like authentic, right? Leaving the question of essence unresolved. Focusing instead of the playful willingness to be related. After all, Tunjana said, what's really there to sort of like, fight about? We are all sort of like playing relatives, right? But the language and the writing is not, the language and writing here is not just about text. And I think this is where art history can sort of like really push the analysis a bit sort of like further, and not just sort of like dwell on the sort of like literary sort of like form, and in fact think of it in sort of like visual term. So as you're all sort of like familiar with the printing or the sort of like the format in which you sort of like write a poem in the sort of like Arabic sort of like script. Often you read it across, right? You don't read it like it's sort of like column where you sort of like in the English language where you read downwards and then you read the second sort of like column. You actually sort of like try to sort of like cross over that thin vertical sort of like line that cuts down sort of like the middle of it, in the middle of the sort of like the page, right? In many ways, that sort of like line, or that's kind of like that sort of like column, the vertical sort of like column that cuts down the middle of the page, has sort of like in some resonance to a new kind of like mental geography of sort of like that has begun to sort of like emerge in the Malay world sometime in the 18th and 19th sort of like century. This is a map from the sort of like 19th century, 1876, and it sort of like shows, it's really one of the two only sort of like Malay maps that have sort of like have survived. And it really shows a sort of like river that sort of like cuts down sort of like the middle of the page, where you have at the center the palace located almost sort of like transversing the two sort of like shoreline of this sort of like river bed, right at the center, number 20 over sort of like here. While other sort of like rivers or other sort of like riverine branches are basically fiefdoms of different kinds of like, overlords and stuff like that. But the Sultan ultimately is someone that is able to straddle across the main kind of like river trunk over here. And for me, what's interesting is that here the Sultan is described as a sea captain, the Nakoda. He is the sort of like sea captain, and he sits on water. It is almost as a sort of course, as a kalima of sort of like Allah. He is the one that's able to sort of like sit above or rest or dwell above the water, right? Where is sort of like all this sort of like going? Compared to sort of like the map that the English was sort of like trying to introduce in sort of like the Malay world, contemporaneous with the emergence of sort of like the Malay map, sort of like Perak. In this particular map, this was shown, it was blown up life size and shown at the inaugural sort of like meeting of the Royal Asiatic Society's sort of like opening meeting, during that opening meeting of that time. And it's described as a kind of like live feed. It's incomplete. It's described as something that's incomplete. It's described as something that's ongoing. And it's described as something as a rapacious sort of like engine in which lands that have not yet been mapped will continue to be sort of like mapped as we sort of like even sort of like speak in this sort of like August hall in the company of sort of like the museum. Actually in a museum like this, it was actually sort of like blown up life size in a museum. Exactly in a museum like this, we describe as an ongoing sort of like enterprise in which the possibilities or the splendid possibilities for the merchants and the planters is boundless, right? The Malay map is sort of like something else. The Malay map shows a different way of sort of like thinking about ideas of sort of like sovereignty. And this sort of like ideas of sovereignty can sort of like, I guess, be found in the sort of like accompanying poem, the sort of like Malay map,
where it describes the Sultan going on a sort of like sea journey using the word mine again, which means play or going places, in a state of sort of like, in order to fulfill what is called his perfect faith or sempurna iman, which could very well be an expression based on Muslim travelers who brought with them the word and the notion of sort of like iman, right? Into sort of like the world. So this idea of sort of like crossing across water and crossing across sort of like boundary and being able to sort of like be comfortable with this sort of like idea of the crossing, right, is something that I think parallels or is contemporaneous with this other sort of like mapping technology that is a lot more sort of like rapacious and is a lot more kind of like centered on this idea of concrete. And you would find similar kind of like imagery appearing in the only sort of like Muharram sort of like celebration video dating to 1909 that is documented in sort of like Singapore. So what I'm showing you here is basically a Muharram procession in Singapore in 1909. It's mislabeled as a Chinese sort of like festival, Chinese New Year festival. The only reason why is because you see a Chinese lion there, and so the very sort of like good, the very sort of nice archivists in Singapore tend to sort of like label everything with a Chinese dragon or a lion dance, you know, Chinese New Year. But clearly, as you sort of like see what's sort of like happening with the procession, with the boats sort of like coming in, with the sort of like tazia that was sort of like being shown before, you know, a galleon boat, and then after that, this larger kind of like tazia sort of like coming into sort of like into view. This is sort of like, you know, a Muharram sort of like celebration that was sort of taking place. And I want to sort of like, you know, end with, and this, and what you see is that you begin to sort of like find connections between, say, for example, an Achinese illustration of sort of like Muharram and a Muharram sort of like stove painting from sort of like Madras as well. So there are a lot of visual iconography that then makes that then sort of like becomes sort of like more and more sort of like immediately apparent if you were to sort of like spend time trying to sort of like decode them. And I guess the role of an art historian is really to sort of like do that, right? But I want to sort of like end with, I guess, the Shair Tabut, which is 60 Shair, that really this is the only existing Shair in sort of like Malay literature that describes the entire sort of like Muharram celebration in sort of Singapore. And in this sort of like Shair, what you get to sort of like see is that the question of what is sungguh or what is kacukan, what is real and what is hybrid, what is center and what is periphery, which is the story of sort of like Hang Tuah, the admiral, the Laksamana Hang Tuah, that I sort of like talked to you, I shared with you about, is really a matter of perspective and position. In the Malay world, these things change all the time. What is Melayu? But the fast-flowing sort of like river on Sumatra, which the word sort of like derived from, it engenders a world that is really centered on adaptiveness, cunning, and wit. More importantly, the story of Hang Tuah, the Laksamana, tells us what is inconclusive is not simply evasion or inertia. It all ends with a dance. It all ends with Hang Tuah sort of like having a dance. 3 steps forward, back, 2 steps back. That's how we negotiate our place among sort of like others, and that is also how we sort of like play relatives, right? In search of what I guess Edward Glissant would call a politics of sort of like relation, made up of sort of like the vacillating spectrum of sort of like composites. It's not about sort of like everything sort of like coming together and forming this sort of like hybrid mush, right? It is how we sort of like roll from one shore to another to make those new sort of like connections. Thank you. bring back this sort of like scroll, because I think a lot of the prevailing theory is that it came from sort of like the Madras regiment. Sometime in the sort of like 19th century, when they were sort of like brought over to Penang to sort of police the new sort of like colonial settlement. If I understand sort of like South Asian sort of like Muharram, based on my sort of like reading of colonial travelogues and what have you, Hobson Johnson, and every single sort of like text that you can sort of like find where the Muharram kind of like emerges as it has always been a very sort of like the playful template was already sort of like there, and I think if there was a sort of like difference, then the difference would have sort of like happened between the Persian and the South Asian way of sort of like celebrating sort of like Muharram. So I'm not quite sure where that kind of like mournful sort of like tone has been sort of like dispensed off. Certainly I know that there is a more mournful sort of like aspect to it, and this normally happens in what we call an ashrakat, which is an imam bara. And that's where you have all your majlis and sort of like stuff like that. And Penang actually had an imam bara, except now that it's been razed and completely demolished because of the persecution against Shiism in Malaysia. But on the level of sort of like street festival, very often you find that they take on a much more sort of like celebratory kind of like aspect, only because I also feel that what the Muharram, I didn't mention just now, is that what the Muharram sort of like was an occasion for, it was also an occasion for sort of like inter-ethnic kind of like, it was really a cross-ethnic kind of like celebration. And it became almost like a sort of open source festival. And if you read the Shai-e-Tabur, what you find is that the Burmese were sort of like joining in with their violins. The Chinese were sort of you saw the Chinese had this sort of like lion dance. Your Malays were sort of like bringing their own sort of like performing at sort of like tradition, and everyone was just out on the street to sort of like have a good time. Alongside with there are also sort of like standard stock carnival sort of like characters from the Muharram. If you read, for example, what Kanun-e-Islam, which is the well-known South Asian sort of like a book on sort of like Islam in sort of South Asia, it lists down all these sort of like stock characters that appears during the Muharram kind of like celebration. A lot of them would also sort of like appear in sort of like subsequent incarnation of the celebration in Penang. So there is definitely that sort of festive atmosphere, but again, it comes through the sort of like South Asian lens, and specifically. But I think what maybe one thing to sort of like highlight is that a lot of the literature tends to focus on 19th century as the point of sort of like transfer. The movement, right? The movement happened in the 19th century. But actually Aceh was already hiring sepoys from Madras all the way back in the 17th and 18th century. So Thomas Forrest would already sort of like, in his travels and accounts would already say that the king of Aceh was already hiring sepoys from sort of Madras way before that. So I think it had a much sort of like earlier pre-colonial, as you said, relationship and presence in at least the eastern part of the western part of Southeast Asia. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Kalapani, yeah. Yeah. Yes, I've looked at that. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I think Frank's work has been very helpful in clarifying a lot of the theory and the way of sort of like thinking for me, especially the articulate sort of like dimension. Yeah, not the play. Yeah. And we use tabut. We use the word tabut instead of taziye or taziyah. The structure. Yeah, I'd love to sort of like see that.
Yeah, but I didn't do. I've not really like about this. But I remember people talking to me about this. Okay, the other thing that was happening right now is that, and in Karachi, right, is that while the Shia would be like, like doing Maghreb and the Sunnis would be cooking nicely. Right? So that's like, what does that mean? The sad that we like, martyr, why are you cooking nicely? So I think the whole thing is very perverse.
But actually, in the original celebration in Malay world, because it's still primarily Sunni, right, is that they cook this particular kind of broth called bubur bubur suro, which is porridge. It's a type of porridge, a sweet porridge that is then distributed to the poor, to every those who cannot afford to eat and stuff like that. Yeah.
And there are also certain foods that have to do with like what was happening in Karbala.
Yeah.
Hussein is kind of a soup, companions to me, certain kind of food. So they do it, but they do it in this very lavish way. So I think there's a whole aspect to Muhammad even in Pakistan that's really
Yeah.
and it's changed over time because what was happening in the 90s there was hardly any police because of the criminality conditions, it's much more securitized and standardized and I think.
Yeah. In Southeast Asia, the only place that celebrates it is still Sumatra. But it's become the only way it could even survive is because it becomes a tourism. Yeah. It's become like a tourist thing, spectacle. Still, it's a spectacle nonetheless.
Which is what Composite is doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like in Turkey, they banned the Sufi order.
Yeah.
So the revival was also through tourism, the whirling dervishes. So they sort of realized that this would help tourism.
Exactly.
So that is how they allowed the dervishes to come back.
And it's the only way. Yeah.
But like we move towards celebration, so we say commemoration.
Okay, yeah.
Is commemorated and not celebrated.
Right.
But I understand.
Yeah, so in my other, actually when I write, I use the word commemoration, but sometimes in order to translate it, I don't know somehow it slips my mind and I use the word celebration, but normally I actually use the word commemorative ritual.
But what I'm interested in is that through this history, what's the current form of Muharram?
There is no more Muharram.
Okay.
It's entirely banned in Malaysia. In fact, if there are Shiites from Iran that lives in Malaysia, because Malaysia has a big Iranian population, and you can really sort of like celebrate in their own home. But if you were caught, passing it on or celebrating with like sort of like a fellow Malay, basically the Malay person can be persecuted. They're very strict about it, and they really they don't look kindly on any kind of like Shiite or something like this.
And also, because from a religious point of view, having a carnival sort of an attitude to Muharram can be very blasphemous.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in Pakistan and India, there was a strong music culture. So we use music also to commemorate Muharram. So someone, I maybe coming from Arabia, would find that blasphemous.
Right.
That why are they singing qawwalis and religious thing? So where I can find this objectionable, that I can also understand someone coming from Arabia finding art qawwali objectionable as well.
So what has survived is that the Borea, right? The Borea is the only thing that has survived, and its roots to Muharram is talked about. It's well known, but it's also sort of acknowledged as this sort of like past in which it emerged from. And now what the Borea is essentially, it's running for UNESCO sort of like World Heritage, tangible heritage kind of like thing, and so it's been sort of like it's been cleaned up and it's been made into this kind of like show and dance that you perform on the stage. It's no longer something that travels.
Coming from Pakistan, we have this image of Malaysia as being very progressive.
Oh, I don't know about that.
When people go there, they find it less conservative. They find more public participation of women in public life.
Yeah.
Tourism, like people like go on on their honeymoon would like to used to go to Malaysia a lot.
Okay.
It's also a good shopping destination before the wedding, you know. And then this is progressive.
Yeah, I don't know if that's progressive, but yes, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. Yeah.
Suddenly from there, when I see this strong, hard line, Shia, anti-Shia attitude, I find it very confusing. Like at one time, there were the Asian tigers and the economy is taking over, and then suddenly this is such a strong orthodox approach to religion. So I find that very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's because state Islam has always been, especially when it sort of like consolidates itself as a sort of instrument of power since the 90s, have tended to sort of like veer towards conservatism. But Malaysian population is also quite diverse, right? The demographics is Muslims are really only about 50%. So there are also the rest of us who are, you know, pagans, kafirs, so many kafirs, not just the Chinese, but also the Indians, South Asians, but also like other indigenous sort of like communities, and especially in Sabah, Sarawak. And okay, if you say like the Chinese and the Indians are considered as migrants within a nationalist sort of like discourse, you have to still contend with very angry sort of like indigenous sort of like communities that belong to other kind of like, you know, indigenous sort of faith that they cannot sort of like, you know, argue against using the migrant sort of like, you know, discourse. And so I think this sort of like creates a lot of check and balances on the ground to make, I guess, the civil society space a lot more sort of like vibrant, and there's a lot more possibility for sort of negotiation. But in terms of like state-sanctioned kind of like view of what Islam is, then it tends to sort of like adopt a much more hardline kind of position. But it's still like everything's up for negotiation.
5 to 50% claim on politics power.
Yeah.
So it has there's a tendency to politicize that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.